Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Climate Justice Charter Movement webinar. During the month of June and July, the Climate Justice Charter Movement has been developing a climate justice policy for zero waste and simple living, in line with one of our 14 systemic alternatives in the Charter. So today is the first of a number of public talks around the topic of zero waste and simple living. And today's topic is on zero waste and jobs, potential job creation through zero waste systems. We have 4 different speakers today: Lefa, Mononga, Joe, Lise, and Patrick, and Ndlovu, and Asiphile, Khanyile. Today we'll begin with our first speaker, Lefa Mononga, who is the chairperson of the South African Waste Pickers Association. Lefa's based in the Free State, Bloemfontein specifically, and he works at a landfill called Northern Landfill under a cooperative called Basdi Wang Primary Cooperative. And he's been an affiliate of the South African Waste Pickers Association for more than 10 years, in fact. So Lefa, if you're ready, you may go.
Okay, cool. Good evening, everyone. As my colleague has already introduced me, my name is Lefa Mononga from South African Waste Pickers Association, Chairperson. Firstly, looking at the potential job creation through zero waste system. Let me start by explaining a zero waste, because not all of us understand what is zero waste. A zero waste is a set of principles focused on waste prevention that encourages the redesign of resources life cycle so that all products are reused. And the goal for that is for no trash to be sent to the landfill or incinerators. And then a zero waste system could bring a better quality in terms of wages and working conditions, if we can apply that model or the system. And then the potential or possible potential jobs created by a zero waste, it could create jobs by improving our national recycling rate. For an example, like if we are following the right path of a zero waste, we might have end up having the forklifters and the people that are working in the warehouses worker and the truck drivers towards a zero waste model. And I believe that by reaching, or for us to reach that goal of a zero waste in South Africa, we want to do it without involving the circular economy in the waste industry. Therefore, I will say it is important for people to understand that there is still a value beyond waste, but with the proper waste management practices and the involvement of relevant stakeholders. The relevant stakeholders like industries and the waste pickers at itself. And then people will need to be taught and shown the value, as it is everyone's responsibility to be environmentally conscious. I'm still with you. Hello?
Yes, Lefa.
Okay. And then the circular economy is the only right or the suitable mechanism able to expand opportunities offered by the sector, and also consumer education by local and international manufacturers of products falling within different waste streams must be empowered to raise awareness on the afterlife of the products they produce. And then the other opportunities for me as an waste picker self, I would say, if we can move to a zero waste model, there are a lot of opportunities in the zero waste, like improving the the conditions for the waste pickers, because like myself, I'm working in the landfill site. And then remember, the aim is not to be in the landfill site for the rest of my life, but to improve or to change. Like now in South Africa, we are keen in the right direction, especially under the waste pickers, the guidelines and the integration of waste pickers. So I believe that if we can only focus on a zero waste model, maybe we can achieve a lot and then change some of the waste pickers future to have maybe a better way, and the career, maybe even the career at itself, because let me now I'm a waste picker, but if we are following the right path towards a zero waste, maybe tomorrow some of us will be the truck drivers, some of us will be working in the warehouses, some of us will be the forklift drivers in the warehouses. Then for me, it will bring a lot of changes. I think for me, I would say that is for me. Hello.
Okay. Then we will move to our next speakers. If Lefa, we will move then to our next speakers, which will be Joe Lees and Patrick Ndlovu from Asiye eTafuleni.
Okay, cool.
Patrick's 30-year career working with informal workers began during his first career as a Metro police officer, enforcing bylaws against manager for eTafuleni municipality, providing administration, dispute resolutions, and social facilitation for traders. He left the city or service in the city in 2006 to co-found Asiye eTafuleni and focus on offering community development and social facilitation services to the informal economy. Patrick's skills and experience with social facilitation and informal traders or informal workers have been recognized globally and is currently a director on WeGo's board. Joanne Lees has 25 years experience as an architect, an urbanist, and a public housing specialist, grappling with a broad array of issues related to inclusive and integrated sustainable management development and spatial transformation. In the process, she has sometimes strayed away from architecture altogether. Jo has been associate of Asiye eTafuleni for many years. She worked with the founders of AET when they were still at the eTafuleni municipality and has periodically worked with AET since their inception. She has been working as a part of the core AET team since 2019. I might have forgotten to mention at the start, but each speaker will have between 10 to 15 minutes to speak. Patrick and Joe, thank you very much.
Thanks, Awande. I just want to share screen. Sorry. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, it is clear.
Okay. So you asked us to speak about waste and jobs. And if I can just say, sorry, before I launch into the presentation, Patrick and I obviously are colleagues. He hates giving presentations, so I'm going to actually do the presentation. But when we get to question time, he is definitely going to be leading that part of our contribution. So that's why we're both here. Yeah, so you asked us to talk about waste and jobs, which doesn't quite fit with the kind of work that we do. So we're going to talk about the kind of work that we have been doing around waste. And it's really more about supporting and retaining waste-related livelihood opportunities in the informal economy. So, you know, in our definition of a job is someone who does work and gets paid. That would include informal work. We're still sitting with a kind of binary perception between formal and informal, but essentially AET works alongside informal workers. And perceptions around informality include a lot of prejudice, particularly around mess and dirt and waste, and informal workers are often blamed for the state of their working environment, where in fact they are part of a much more complex kind of urban management challenge around service provision, and waste management is part of that. What we do know is that informal recyclers save municipalities millions of rands in collections and landfill space, and they contribute significantly to attainment of sustainability goals. So informal recycling obviously does provide valuable livelihood opportunities, as we just heard from Lefa. And the recent waste picker integration guidelines recognize these, but a lot more work needs to be done. And I think from an AET's perspective, you know, all of our work is about, and I'm not managing to move the slide, sorry. All of our work is really about enhancing livelihood opportunities. Sorry, that was a brief outline. I couldn't move the slide. So this slide here, you can just see sort of what I say about complex kind of urban management challenges. That's litter gathering that doesn't get collected by waste collectors, city waste collectors, but the infrastructure has been broken for months and hasn't been fixed. And informal workers are expected to work in that environment. And the perception of this terrible environment kind of reflects on them. And yeah, so it's complicated. This is just a little overview of the way AET works. You can read more about this on our website. I don't really want to waste too much time here, but essentially we're about urban innovation, talk about urban intelligence. We spend a lot of time on the street, observing, talking to people, responding to what's emerging from the street. Documentation, dissemination, research, understanding, and a lot of that is about reducing prejudice. And then obviously advocacy, which is a big part of our work. This is where we work. So there's Durban. Most of our work is concentrated in Warwick Junction, which is this area here, 6,000 to 8,000 informal workers just in that area. So the work does have sort of national and even international impact, but a lot of the on the ground work is in that area. So first I want to talk about our work with carts and conveyances. And it's really just talking about, it's one of our key interventions across the board is around providing supportive infrastructure and recognizing the importance of the right tools and equipment. And that would include for waste pickers, waste workers, you know, basics such as protective clothing. But one quite key area of work in recent years has been around carts. We've been working with informal recyclers for over 10 years. And there's been quite an evolution of carts. So this is just showing what sort of the street solutions are. People make a plan, sort of crates with wheels, part of a shopping trolley. There's a shopping trolley being used. People kind of using whatever open space they can find to kind of bundle their waste, in this case also wetting it, using the sidewalk. And again, this contributes to a kind of negative perception because there is nowhere else for them to work. So a lot of the research over the years sort of identifying some of the key challenges for informal recyclers: exposure to dirt, pollution elements, heavy loads, long distances, inability to afford trolleys. As I said, people make a plan. Scarcity of cardboard supply, that varies. Theft of cardboard, a lot of homeless people and are sort of also collecting cardboard as a survivalist activity. And quite often people who are sort of committed recyclers end up having their loads stolen. Quite a lot of exploitation by some of the middlemen and also some of the waste generators who expect the recyclers to do quite a lot of the work in order to get the waste. And a lack of recognition from city officials for the work provided. So that's not across the board, but quite complicated relationships between informal recyclers and the authorities. For a long time, there was a project where we partnered with the city through the Imagine Durban program, and it was called Friends of Recyclers, an initiative called Friends of Recyclers. And this was really about sort of supporting sustainable practices, And a lot of the emphasis on that was on carts, but also, as I said, other protective equipment, protective gear is really important. It was a 3-month process, but it's had ongoing impacts, and there was design of and testing of various different carts working with the recyclers. So AT developed and co-designed these with the workers on the street, various different kinds of carts. So this one, known as the Ganda Ganda, it's the biggest one, carries a lot of cardboard, it's really strong, but also really expensive. This was a sort of folding down version, so the sides fold up or down depending on what sort of load you're carrying. There's a bag there for personal belongings. Similar folding trolley, but with a different handle. These are sort of off-the-shelf available trolleys with sort of some amendments, and the bag, which never really took off, it's too heavy. This on the top left, those ones, that is the latest iteration and is the preferred iteration. The bottom center picture shows a recent issue of trolleys to a whole lot of recyclers in the Mayville area in Durban. It's cheap, it's easy to store because it folds up almost flat. And the bottom right-hand picture shows how much bulk you can actually fit onto it. The top right is part of a broader kind of NMT, non-motorized transport initiative that we've been working in. So a lot of informal traders use trolleys as well as waste recyclers. But obviously that's complicated because a lot of those trolleys are stolen, not necessarily by the people who are using them. So we've been partnering with SPA, using some of their sort of trolley bins, but put on a much stronger chassis with much better wheels. So that's the kind of work that we've been doing with carts. And then obviously maintenance. So working with the recyclers so that they know how to maintain the trolleys. Wheels in particular take a beating, particularly on unmaintained sidewalks. And you can just see everybody in their gear. And having some kind of uniform also dignifies the activity, identifies people as actually sort of they're in that space doing a job, and starts to improve perceptions. So out of that project, there were various kind of positive outcomes. There was quite a bit of press coverage about it. And we do believe that in some quarters, perception improved. I think the relationship with the city improved, although that ebbs and flows. But certainly everyone ended up with a much better understanding of what integrated waste management might look like. It was entered into a competition, and this is just a little video, one recycler's experience. Okay, so what we realized from working with the carts is that, under doing all the research, identifying participants, working closely with them, testing and evaluating trolleys, really the next step needed to be urban infrastructure. So the next bit of the talk really is talking about that. So again, there are many areas where waste pickers work in a particular area. They follow certain routes, they have a process. So what we did is we followed them in various different areas. This is just one, it's an example. So it's a day in the life, as it were, to try and understand the processes. We mapped all of that. So how much people carry, how long it takes them, where they go, who they collect from, and what, where the various collection and selling points are. So there was a whole kind of research process. This is what a typical kind of collection point looks like. So it takes up quite a lot of space on the sidewalk where people are kind of gathering their cardboard, having to flatten it, bundle it, and then wait for the collection agents to come. So there isn't dedicated space for it. This is just a summary. So we started partnering again with the city, this time through the architecture department, trying to kind of get a sense of what the process might be, to get a sense of what appropriate infrastructure, urban infrastructure might support those processes. And mainly Richard Dobson, who's the other founder of Asiye eTafuleni. He's also an architect. This is a design for a sort of sidewalk adaptation, basically. So a widened portion, a place for the truck to pull up, and infrastructure, a screen that could sort of be removed when it's not being used. But essentially what you see there is what would happen on a waste collection at a waste collection time. So it's just adaptation of existing infrastructure to allow for this activity that basically annoys a lot of people and creates a negative perception because it isn't provided for. Then there were various ideas developed for how different facilities could be inserted into the urban fabric. This one was sort of small storerooms, storage space for trolleys, storage space for recycled goods, some ablutions. So really basic kind of facility developed as a concept. And then the city agreed that they would provide funding for one facility. So this one on Palmer Street was identified, the site was identified as a potential hub for a number of these smaller satellite ones. And essentially the concept of this really is what we call a safe sidewalk. So it's very, very simple: clearview fencing, a roof, some ablution facilities, a training room, a gathering space where people can be off the street, bundling and working with their waste. They can store their trolleys overnight. They can have work gear stored overnight, their ablution facilities, so they can change. And it really just dignifies the process and makes it much more efficient. It's also now not spilling into the street. So this facility has been built. The operating is still kind of erratic, sometimes working really well, sometimes not, sometimes a big group of waste workers, sometimes not. But we are learning all the time from how this facility is operating. And then the last thing I want to just talk about is a project that we're involved in together with groundWork. So Asiphile, who's going to talk next, is part of that team, funded by the UMI Fund. We're also working with DUT Urban Future Center. And this one is much more with a climate change focus. And it's around innovative zero waste solutions from the informal street markets. So we're looking to build on existing practices. And the idea is to minimize waste to landfill. So climate justice, obviously an important part of that, waste integration, etc. And I think the important thing is that the link here between, and it's what Lefa was saying, the link between circular economy, zero waste, and potential for jobs. So the estimate, Gaia estimate, is over 44,000 new jobs if we were able to recover 80% of recyclable material in Durban. So the project started with a whole lot of research, ethnographic research, just observation on the street, desktop research, and essentially some of the conclusions that there were some promising existing practices that we could follow up on. a huge amount of organics, which became a very obvious area of intervention. And then there are sort of more complex waste streams, which are integrated with some of the others, but urine and human waste we're finding hugely challenging. Water, so we're working with some cooks at the moment around trying to reduce polystyrene, but if they can't use reusable containers, if they don't have access to water to wash them, so that starts getting quite complex. We did a photo voice process working with informal traders in Warwick, and I've just put this slide up as one example of some of the feedback that came out of that. But I think this, again, it comes to, you know, down to perceptions and how there's so much prejudice around informality. And I think to see it from the other side and the extent to which people also are having to work in an environment that is not clean, and the impact that that has on them, and the dehumanizing kind of impacts of that. And the lack of social protection, which again, kind of Lefa mentioned. So we particularly saw it through the pandemic, where waste pickers weren't allowed to work, businesses were closed, and there's absolutely no kind of safety net for informal workers at all. So trying to link this work, working towards zero waste, but understanding that social protection for waste workers has to be absolutely integral in that. So where we are at the moment, last year was essentially a research year. This year we've been sort of designing some pilot projects that we are hoping to start implementing very soon. But some of the ideas, so working with the waste pickers and reclaimers to sort of build partnerships, do some movement building, organizing, supporting capacity building, etc. Diverting organics from the early morning market is one of the key pilots that started. And then we are working on a particular corner in Warwick around a toilet block where there also are a lot of cooks. It's almost like a little food court area. And then the blue bubbles are various other potentials that we're exploring in between. So the first, the organics to compost from the early morning market. Sorry, I just want to tell you there's 400 tons of organics annually that currently go to landfill that could be diverted and turned into compost. So this was an initial baseline study where we literally were sorting through bins and weighing everything and identifying the percentage of organics. It's over 80%, close to 90% of the waste that comes out of that market is compostable. Currently working on a very small experiment with using at the Botanic Gardens and working with the horticulture department also at DUT. So this is just the beginning. So we're sort of testing, trying to get a bit of proof of concept going. So that's where that pilot project is at the moment. And then the other one is on this corner, which, as I said, operates a little bit like a food court. So we're hoping to work quite closely with the cooks, and have already identified some promising practices where there are people who are using reusable containers rather than polystyrene, although polystyrene is a problem. And as I said, complicated because of lack of access to water. The toilet block, unfortunately, is dysfunctional at the moment. So that pilot's really at the beginning. We're in the design stages, working very closely with the community on the ground. And as part of that, we organized for the roof of the toilet block to be cleared. So there's a before and after. And that's really part of understanding that it's very difficult to start changing behavior in an environment where the whole environment looks a little bit like the left-hand picture. So just as part of getting a conversation going about zero waste practices, about different waste practices, needing to kind of sort out the environment a little bit before we can even begin. So I'm going to end there. Thank you. And over to you, Awande.
Thank you very much for that presentation. And now we'll move on to our next speaker, Asiphile Khanyile, who works at groundWork. She's a zero waste project campaigner since 2021. She's mainly working closely with civil society on waste management and zero waste. Finally, Asiphile has over 4 years of experience on conducting environmental education, working with communities, and waste academic research. Asiphile, over to you.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Okay. Okay. So as Awanda has mentioned, my name is Asiphile Khanyile, and I work for groundWork as a zero waste project campaigner. The introduction, here's an overview of what I'm going to be talking to you about today. It's very simple. Introduction, who are we as groundwork and how do we work with civil society, followed by looking at just the waste management system in the lens of a linear economy as well as a circular economy, and then delving it down to zero waste and jobs. And finally, what do we need to do? And I'll end off with a conclusion. So groundwork, we are a nonprofit environmental justice and developmental NGO. Our aim is basically to improve the quality of life of vulnerable people, especially in South Africa, but we are now expanding into many parts of Africa. And we do this by working with civil society, assisting them to have a greater impact of environmental governance. And so groundwork has 6 thematic campaigns. We have the Climate and Energy Justice Campaign, Coal Campaign, Environmental Health, Environmental Justice School, Media Campaign, and the Waste Campaign where I'm based. So our work spans across different sectors of the environment. So when we're looking at waste, we must bear in mind that globally, the quantities are increasing. And this is a result of aspects such as your rising population growth, our consumption patterns are evolving, and also we have rapid economic growth. These are some of the 3 main aspects. These are some of amongst others. And this results into the waste, the waste management system being overburdened and sometimes becoming complex. So then when we're looking at waste management in the lens of this a linear economy, we must ask ourselves, firstly, where does waste come from? What are the sources of waste? In most cases, we always say waste comes from our households, it comes from the industry or institutions. So institution could be your educational institutions, it could be your health institutions. However, waste is everywhere. And if we look deeper into the way the system is or the linear economy, you can see that from each of the phases, for instance, where resources are extracted, where they are produced or manufactured, consumed, and disposed, there is waste produced in each and of those sectors. So as groundwork, we call this the extractive economy because it sticks, you burn and you dispose. You're actually taking resources out of the earth and not putting them out and not putting them back into the earth. So unfortunately, this also results into undesirable methods of disposal. So you get your open dumping, your landfilling, and as well as the worst case scenario, incinerations. And these systems actually contribute a lot to the greenhouse gas emitted into the atmosphere. They contribute a lot to health impacts, and actually they contribute mainly to climate change. And so the linear economy, which is in line, actually is not favorable, and hence we need a systematic change. And when we're looking at systematic change in the waste, I think the big one that is currently the hot topic in the waste sector is what we call the circular economy, and has also, Lefa has alluded, basically the circular economy asks us to basically put things back into the system, rejuvenate, renew, rebuild. So that is basically what we call a regenerative economy. So we are looking at a systematic change, especially in the production value chain. So looking at what do we mean by this? How do we use our natural resources? How do we, like, for instance, redesign our products? Now, for instance, if you walk into a shop and you are buying yourself a perfume or cologne, you find that it's in a glass, for instance, container with the box, and it has plastics around it, and they put it into a plastic. Actually, that is over packaging. So we must look at things, how to redesign them. But also within the circular economy, there should be dignified and safe working conditions. And I think that that's what my comrades have actually been alluding to, that in the circular economy, there's actually a change even the way that we work. But most importantly, it asks for us to restore our natural systems. Now, Zero waste is basically the hot topic. It is the in thing when you're talking about, when you're talking to people, especially in the waste sector. Now, what is similar to zero waste and circular economy, when you read more about them, some people use these terms interchangeably, and that is because there are so many common denominators around them. So for instance, we are taking look at the definition of zero waste. It's very simple. One, we need to conserve resources. How do we do this? Responsible production, responsible consumption, reuse, and recovery of products, especially packaging, and as I mentioned earlier. But the catch is that we must do this without burning. So that's where your issues of incineration, for instance, are not allowed. And the discharge onto land, water, air, and because all of these things, they threaten the natural environment. So that's what zero waste has basically asked us to do, to be responsible in how we extract, how we produce, how we consume, and how we dispose at the end. And hence, when you're looking at the zero waste system, or the 6 R's now of a regenerative economy, you realize, for instance, that recycling, which is dominant, is actually not enough. Firstly, we must start by resisting. We don't need sometimes to have a plastic bag, for instance, when you go to a shop. Then you move on to the main 3 R's, you reduce, reuse, recycle. But then now there's also repurpose. So for instance, our electronic waste, they can be repurposed into other more viable goods. And then the final part would be residuals, the waste that sometimes is very hard to deal with. However, with residual, it's very important to actually find out where does it come from? And that is actually going to help you address that waste should not end up in waste streams. It should not be ending up in rivers, for instance, into the oceans or into the onto the land. So we must know where does it come from. Then we're looking at jobs that are found for zero waste. What I've noticed that when you're looking at zero waste jobs, many of them are already existing. So I think what my colleagues have been alluding to is that we have, for instance, recycling. And in South Africa, it's the one that is mostly dominant, where we have waste pickers and reclaimers who are actually diverting tons and tons of waste away from dump sites, away from landfill. And this actually saves a lot of landfill space, but actually it contributes more to climate change mitigation. So we refer to our waste pickers and reclaimers as our environmental heroes. And then there's also repurposing. Electronic waste is a very delicate waste stream, especially in South Africa. And so there are people who are actually repurposing it and actually reusing it for other materials. So there are centers. However, now it's how do we bring these at a community level where people, if you do not have, you don't know what to do with your old cell phone, your old TV, your old kettle, where do we take it to? Because that is a very delicate waste stream. Manufacturing, it's also another place where we actually can harness jobs. For instance, how to use what we already have, making newspapers from recycled paper. Composting, I think right now the focus in the waste sector, again, is the issue of methane that is produced from organic waste. And this calls for now how to basically separate organic waste, and what existing practices can we actually filter into is basically composting. Now, composting, though, does not mean that you just take your organic waste and put it into, for instance, a container, but it means it needs people to collect that. It will also need people to treat that, because it's a different delicate type of waste stream. And that will actually enhance separation at source. So imagine a system where you have recyclables, where you have your composting or compostable or organic waste, as well as the waste that is taken by the municipality. I think that is actually a better system. And with this careers that I've mentioned, we need people, for instance, at a community level. There are people who are actually unemployed, and this is basically a place where they can actually benefit. And also farming. Most commercial farmers, even subsistence farmers, sometimes they use what we call chemical fertilizers. We can actually, for instance, using a system where compostables are sent to farmers, and that's how they can use organic waste to enhance what they do. So right now, these are just examples of already existing practices. For me and for what I've learned so far is that zero waste is a journey. So we're not perfect, but instead we are learning from each other. So there could be more that can still come. There could be more that are yet to be discovered. But now that we know that these exist, for instance, jobs exist, for us is to ask ourselves, what can we do to harness them or invest in them to uplift these practices, but most importantly, to protect human rights, to ensure that these practices do not foster, for instance, exploitation. And I see that through zero waste, we have a better chance to address, for instance, our 3 developmental issues: poverty, inequality, and unemployment. It may be at a small scale level, but I believe that it actually has a big impact at a bigger scale. And so through zero waste, you can have even your cooperative production where people are working for themselves. People are not just working for a wage or just at the end of the year salary, but they know that they can invest in their own skills, and people owning their own spaces. So that is how, for instance, we see, the potential of zero waste, and especially addressing the issues of unemployment. So what can we do? With this list, it's a list with some of the stuff that is already happening, but some of the stuff needs to, be improved. And like I said, zero waste, it's an ongoing journey. So for instance, the redesign of packaging, as I mentioned, an example of the cologne or perfume, phasing out non-recyclables or non-reusable materials that do not benefit anyone or even the value chain, that are just destined for disposal. That is practical. And I think another one that is dominating the waste sector is the extended producer responsibility, where we say producers of materials need to be responsible for their waste and where it ends up. It should not just be responsible for consumers. How do we work together, for instance, with consumers, industry, as well as communities to ensure that this process is actually filters down at a community level? But also, what is important about this process of EPR, it should not be exclusionary, but rather it should be inclusive and consultative, especially for people who are actually working directly with waste. So for instance, we are looking at your waste pickers and reclaimers. And then what else can we do is harnessing and supporting the roles or the jobs that are actually there, like a role played by waste pickers and reclaimers, making separation at source more easy, making separation at source more viable, but actually making separation at source more environmentally sound. So those are the things that we can do. And I think that South Africa has started paving that path by using, for instance, the South African waste picker integration guidelines. But these guidelines need to also be filtered down into the municipal level, where the waste is actually generated and where people are actually affected by waste. And then finally, is to create an enabling environment for zero waste jobs to thrive. And that is why we have to move from the linear economy into a circular economy. And to just conclude, I think with all of this, we can see that waste is not just something that you throw away, but there's a lot more. The story is bigger than what we see. So it's very, very complex. But when we talk about zero waste, we must always remember that it's actually a form of systematic change. Because it's more environmentally sound, it's more economically viable, and it has sustainable solutions. It's not about, buying a big machine that's going to crush waste, and then after a year it's going to collapse, and now you're going to need more money to actually buy a new one. So we must make sure that zero waste is actually inclusive of communities, people, industries, as well as government. It's low cost. It doesn't need to be expensive. For instance, take stuff such as composting. It cannot be expensive, and it's context specific. Even in Africa, we live in different countries, but also even within South Africa, we have different provinces and different communities. So it has to be local. It has to be context specific. Also, zero waste, we're saying it has to be resilient. For instance, take the issue of the recent Durban floods. That showed that actually what climate change can do. So for us is how to ensure that we are more resilient to such shocks, and that it fosters a circular economy. So with that being said, this is where I got most of my information, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Asiphile. And now we can move on to our question and answer part of this panel. So for anyone who has a question, please include it into the chat and we'll read it out to our panelists who will be able to answer you. So just to get things going, my first question, and I'll direct it at Asiphile first, but Patrick and Joe, please feel free to jump in also. With regards to the topic or the area of focus of zero waste, it has really great implications with regards to the fight for climate justice and also fight for protecting our environment and ecology. What more has to be done to try link or to connect the concept of zero waste to the general populace in terms of understanding it as an integral fight in not just our fight for climate justice, but also for environmental and ecological protection? What more does zero waste need to do, or how can we make these connections for the average person to understand how important zero waste is? Asiphile?
Okay, yes. I think we have to, make it realistic in such a way that, for instance, if you were to use the case of the floods in Durban, we received rainfall that was meant to be, that we receive in a year. So it's like, how come we receiving it in 2-3 days time? That is something realistic. But also, if you want to show people how zero waste works at a local level, you can take, like, for instance, a demonstration, empty a bin for him or her and say, this waste, if it were to be composted, what can you benefit from it? If you were to, look at a plastic, how long does it take to decompose? So you can have practical measures. And I think with zero waste, I think we should move from the concept that we need something bad to happen to then understand that we need to change. We need to change now before things they can get worse. So that would be my answer for now. You were on mute?
Sorry, Joe, Patrick, do you have anything to add to that?
I think really, from our perspective and the work we do, I think it's really just to get people to understand that supporting recycling work at all scales. So at the scale of an individual waste picker who's coming and sorting through your bin bag that you put out on the street once a week, being, not prejudiced against that person, supporting them, maybe separating the stuff out so that they don't have to dig through the bag, they can see it. So from that scale right through to choices about what people buy, choices about packaging, and then, as Asiphile was saying, industry. So I think it's trying to get people to understand the complexity and to act across different scales, and to support the work that people are doing instead of sort of almost sidelining it. It's something, it needs to be mainstreamed as an idea. Education maybe is one way, but as Asiphile says, it's when there's a disaster, people suddenly wake up. How many disasters do we need?
Also working alongside and also, incorporating their ideas, because they are the experts, in this field. So respect, and also, the red tape and, and exploitation, harassment. So inclusive and incorporation and taking the, ideas, exchange ideas, definitely, I think it's their solution, and respect each other. and incentivize, the work that they are doing by both government and the city.
Yeah, which again talks to social protection. They are such a vulnerable group and they're providing such an incredibly valuable service.
I think those points really have so many implications in terms of understanding these barriers and what could happen if we're just able to move those away, and the potential to see what zero waste can do once it's protected and once it's supported at that level. I think your responses also answer the question by Portia in the chat with regards to how municipalities don't take zero waste seriously, or waste collection seriously in that regard. I'm going to, another question I see here is from Asiphile, who asks, can there be a suggestion on how the zero waste approach can be introduced in our so-called township areas like Bambai and Guamashu, as the containers that are on the roadsides are overflowing? Bambai has no collection. I'm not sure if that touches too closely on the contributions you've just made, but do you have any thoughts around that, Asiphile, Patrick, Joe? Asiphile?
Okay. Yes. I think with that, because it's at, like, for instance, a municipal level. And I think that is where I even use the example of the waste picker integration guidelines, that they're at a national level and they still need to be filtered down. So we, for instance, as, like, for instance, groundwork, we try to lobby with municipalities to understand their mandate, that they actually have to provide such a service. And that is where we want to work, for instance, with community organization groups at a local level so that they have a voice. And we provide, for instance, activists in the environmental justice school, how to review things such as a constitution, because it is your right to be protected, it is your right to be safe. So it is your right to have a waste collection services. So now how do we approach that? So I think that is where the thing of collective action can help, because as one community member, you can't go to a municipal office and then tell them, because they might turn you away. But if we're a group of people, you then actually have a better chance, because you have one voice, you have a stronger voice, but actually you also have collective action. So that would be my answer.
So I will, I think also, our communities need to be conscientized and educated, because currently some people, they just throw waste, waste or litter, everywhere. And if you confront and ask them, why don't you use the bin provided? They say they are creating jobs, for street sweepers. So there's quite a lot that, of education that needs to be, to be done. For communities to keep their areas, clean, and also that, by, waste create, a lot of job opportunities if it's recycled.
So another question we have here is, so actually I have a comment from David Ngubuga, who says, I think the Minister of Recreation should start the modernization in order to open up for job creation. And then we have a question from Vincent Siwawa to Joe and Patrick, who says, do you have any system or technology to track the performance of waste reclaimers towards zero waste? Remember, data on actual contribution of waste reclaimers is limited and uncertain. So how do we ensure that we have accurate and reliable data to monitor the performance of municipality solid waste management towards zero waste?
So I'll start, but part of the intention of a facility like the Palmer Street sort of waste recycling facility that I showed, that there's a scale there, and part of the intention was that the waste coming in there could be weighed and could be documented. So the trees that were planted around the park on the edge, those are significant in that each one represents an amount of carbon sequestrated and carbon saved through cardboard recycling. And the idea was to have a big billboard, you know, some kind of board up there that on a daily basis talks about, and to people, you know, just going past, how much waste has been saved from landfill in that facility on that day. But really it requires research. You know, all the middle agents who are buying waste from even the informal recyclers, they all have a log. They keep an accurate log of what they're buying, how much they're paying for it. They won't necessarily want to reveal all of that, but it's not that the information doesn't exist. It requires a concerted kind of research effort to gather the information, process the data, and be able to understand and quantify it properly. A lot of the information is available or would be easily available if we just made the effort. Around the performance of municipalities, we're probably not the right people to talk about that. There's so much contention around that. And the issue of informal settlements, again, it's just, you know, they're not ratepayers, they're not being prioritized for service delivery. It's a huge problem.
I think it also extends to what you just said now, that we can't really separate this question from the nature of the built environment and some of the gaps in terms of that development which we've missed post-apartheid. And I think that the zero waste conversation for a lot of people is also an entry point into, you know, critiquing and problematizing the way in which our cities and towns have been built and developed. So we have to also have that conversation at some point in terms of linking those two. Another question we have from Dr. Janet Munakamwe, to what extent has the city of Joburg integrated waste pickers, reclaimers, or recyclers into the waste management as previously envisaged? This in a way which could assist in addressing the social security deficits and infrastructure. To anyone who would like to take that question.
We don't know. Not in a position to answer that, sorry.
Asiphile?
Perhaps somebody in the audience.
Yeah, I also may try. What has been happening, for instance, in Johannesburg, let's say, for instance, your waste reclaimers are more, African Reclaimers Organization is more active. So they are actually, you know, separation at source project that are actually doing with the municipalities, but to the point where it's now in the formal waste management system, I'm also not too sure about it, but there are forums, for instance, your waste picker forums that they hold, I think on a monthly, if not every 2 months, that actually play a part for waste pickers to talk about their issues and how they would like to be, for instance, integrated into the waste management systems. So there are platforms like that. As to say that formally are they integrated, I think maybe it's like we can say we pay to paving, you know, it's paving. Yes.
We have a hand from Keith Roman. Keith will give you the ability to speak if you unmute.
Hi, Wande, thank you very much. Yeah, just a comment. I am the CEO of the Zero Waste Association of South Africa. And I know, I think my understanding is that the majority of waste pickers are involved more on the recycling side than on the composting side. And from the pilot project that we're currently undertaking in partnership with the Cape Agulhas municipality, is that we find that the separation of organic waste and composting offers a huge opportunity for not only creating job opportunity and income generation to waste pickers, but obviously a huge benefit to the municipality itself. So I'm certainly prepared to make the outcomes reports available to everybody, to anybody who is interested. And I do know that in order for the composting to be a success, one needs a partnership with the municipality. And unfortunately, some of the municipalities that I know of are exploiting the waste pickers. For example, I know about a municipality that recently gave a tender contract to a private contractor, 48 million rand, yet the waste pickers who are operating at that municipality are not giving any funds from the municipality itself. So that situation needs to change, and if in any way that we can assist the waste pickers, we will. So I am in close contact with Madi of SAWPA, Western Cape, and we work together to see how we can overcome some of these problems at the municipal level. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Keith. And if anyone is interested in any of that information, please leave your email in the chat, and we'll make sure to send it to any of those who would like. Our next question, oh, sorry, Joy, you may go.
Sorry, thank you. Just a comment to add on to Keith's comment is, that in the pilot projects that we are just beginning in Warwick, and one of them is a composting one, those questions around, whose waste is it, are already arising. So as soon as it's recognized that what is currently seen as waste is potentially profitable, you start getting into it starts to become contested, and whose waste is it? So I think that thing of, suddenly there's a valuable waste stream with potential to generate income, and the next thing you know, it's privatized, and the people whose practices have already started the ideas founded on existing practices, but at a small scale, those people get excluded. It is a concern.
Our next question is from Thomas Aneni. How can industry be encouraged to go zero waste? Asiphile?
I think that's through, for instance, extended producer responsibilities. That is the mandate that actually sometimes now, because previously more things were voluntary, but now is basically, asking them that they have to take care of what they produce. And that actually can play a very positive role towards going zero waste, that industry has to take care of what they produce at the end of the day. So that for me would be an answer, and that is a practical start. Thanks.
Thank you. Joe, Patrick, do you have anything to add on that?
Not at this stage, thanks.
So our next question is, what is the entry point for startup SMEs, or is it big business terrain only? I think we can actually add cooperatives into that mix. I believe the role of entrepreneurship can be valuable. It's from Tulani Shabala. Do any of our panelists would any of our panelists like to take that? Asiphile?
I think I'll have to think about that more deeply.
Joe, Patrick?
Unfortunately, it's not our area of expertise, at the moment, but definitely we will be, working on it as well. Do some research.
I would like to add a question then to any of the panelists also. In terms of zero waste systems and zero waste structures globally, what are some of the other examples that you feel that South Africa can look to in terms of how we can manage in our towns and cities to integrate zero waste systems and to make the kind of transition that we would require? Any of the panelists can take that one. That's to all three of you.
Okay. Well, for instance, in our zero waste project, we are working with partners that are also outside South Africa. For instance, in Tanzania, they have a big scale, for instance, for composting. We're also working with countries such as Ghana. And also we have Sao Paulo in Brazil. So there are learnings from other countries as well. It's just that now collating them and, showcasing them that what is that they're doing. So there are studies of such systems and such practices that exist. And what's interesting about them is that they are in developing countries and in Africa, especially.
I think that's a great example. Not only just a developing country in Africa, but it's quite close to us in East Africa, Tanzania. I think Kira Owen in the chat says for large scale composting, I think that Sao Paulo is leaps and bounds ahead, which is another, Brazil being another country which is quite similar to South Africa, not only in its status as a developing country, but also because of the scale of inequality that country faces. So there's a lot of things that we can learn in terms of those kind of lessons from countries like ours. If anyone has any questions that they'd like to throw in the chat, I see Keith has added the Zero Waste Europe and Mother Earth Foundation Philippines has a very good zero waste system models. I think these are very important points because we have a lot to learn from our neighbors globally. Luambo says material recovery facilities are needed in South Africa. Any other questions that anyone would like to pose to our panelists as we have a little bit of time? And you can just add them to the chat or raise a hand. But in the meantime, before we add any of, take any more of these questions while people are still thinking of questions, I'd just like to ask the panelists, Patrick, Joe, in terms of your experience in the zero waste space and these topics, and Asiphile also, I'd like to extend this to you, the kind of connections that you see being made by people working in this space to other focus areas. What are you seeing? What potential do you see for those kind of connections and those kind of collaborations with people working in other spaces that are environmentally or ecologically linked? Might not be directly tied to zero waste, but there may be that kind of tangential relationship, for example, with the environmental justice and ecological movements. Do you see any of those kind of bridges being crossed and the potential for those links to be made? Asiphile?
Okay, we can look at, for instance, agroecology, where we're saying, for instance, there's mass production of, how we produce our food. There's also, like, for instance, where we basically put a lot of fertilizers, the chemical fertilizers that actually contribute negatively to the environment. So how we use, for instance, things such as composting that actually can enhance agroecology, where people are learning to farm for themselves, but also enhancing the farming industry. So that could be an example where we can make, like, for instance, cross-cutting links. What people were seeing as waste or organic waste, something that's not going to be reused, is now filtering into, for instance, commercial farming. So that is in a practical, more sensible example that I can actually throw it in there.
Joe, Patrick, do you have anything to add to that?
I think just a general comment that it needs to succeed, we need systemic change. Our economic systems, our food systems, all of those things are completely bound up with our waste systems, our consumption patterns. We need broad systemic change. So it's one thing to kind of look at waste and waste integration, but you can't look at that without looking at other things. Even the very small example that I made in the presentation of where you've got somebody who's a very busy street cook who is using reusable plates for her customers. The struggle that she has to access water to be able to wash those and a proper place to dispose of that water afterwards. That's a systemic infrastructure, but it's not just about infrastructure. It's about, you then say, well, why isn't the infrastructure there? Why isn't that being prioritized? Who should be doing it? Who should pay for it? And you look at this tiny little microscopic problem and you find that the solution is really at city government level at the very least. And it's so bound up with everything else. You actually can't be looking at it separately. Everything's connected, which I know sounds like a really trite answer, but it is how it is.
We also need a buy-in, from our municipalities and, government, local government as well, for the provision of space, because currently it is contested, and yeah. So a buy-in is very, very important, from the government, especially within the urban areas. Currently we only, being assisted by botanical gardens, and it's just for a pilot. But if this comes to fruition, definitely we'll need a bigger space. And so, as I'm saying, buy-in from our municipality or municipalities is very important to support and to make sure that this idea comes to fruition.
I think as the points that you've made, and as you also had spoken about it in your presentations, that this is about rethinking the way in which we do things, the way we consume and the way that we live. So it's always worth re-emphasizing that it's at all those levels that these things need to be thought about. It can never be too much to re-emphasize that has to be thought of and managed in that way. I just want to read some of the other comments in the chat. Kira Owen said, I think with regards to some of these other examples, Pune and other cities in India, they have very strong waste picker associations, organizations that advocate for law reform and waste. Dr. Janet says, given the large tons of bio-waste, could this provide some of the solutions towards a just energy transition? I think I'd like to actually direct that at our panelists. We'll continue with our usual order. Asiphile, being an environmental educator, also your thoughts on this question, given the large tons of bio-waste, could this provide some of the solutions towards a just energy transition?
Okay. Well, for instance, there's what we call biodigesters or anaerobic digestion, where we actually have your food waste and they convert that into energy. So that is actually a practical thing. So, but now the catch would be, it has to be at a large scale, because we are talking about energy here. So it's going to be more, that you're building something that has to be large scale, but also with, for instance, using biowaste for energy, it involves a lot of engineering that needs to be done. But actually, it's something that people are actually starting to move towards, such as that, taking the case of people moving towards solar because of energy problems that we have. So there are cases where people are actually using the systems. Yes.
Joe Patrick?
Yeah, I think nothing specific to add. I think that's the obvious. Using the methane from organics to generate energy. It's more complicated, as Asiphile was saying, than it appears to be. So we did do quite a detailed investigation into using some years ago, using some of the organic waste from the market to generate energy for some of the cooks adjacent to the market. And there's prejudices around using methane to cook. It's quite high tech, so it needs a lot of supervision. If you start putting the wrong things into your biodigester, you can kill the bacteria and the process doesn't work, and then it all smells and gives the whole thing a kind of literally a bad odor, and nobody wants to do it. So it requires quite a lot of management, intensive sort of management. It's more high tech than it initially appears to be. So, you know, if you're looking to do sort of small scale local interventions along those lines, yeah, slightly more complicated than it initially appears to be. So that's why Asiphile is saying it really needs to work at scale. The landfill, the newest landfill site in Durban, they have designed the landfill in order to capture the methane to generate energy. Part of the problem is that that landfill is so far from the city that you've still got to transport all the waste to there. So whether the cost benefit numbers work, I don't know. It's obviously worth pursuing as an idea, but we haven't come across a really kind of viable community-based solution. That's, yeah.
I think the emphasis on community-based solution is the most important thing, also because any of those processes or any of those ideas, the way that we think about integrating them to a society, it has to start at that level. We have another comment here from Dr. Mononga, who says, I guess we need more radical organizing strategy for this sector. In other words, waste pickers, recyclers, reclaimers play a fundamental role in alleviating the crisis of space for landfills, and thus the idea should be to demand to be integrated into the mainstream waste management system, and politicians should not instrumentalize them during elections, which I think is true, that we also have that potential, unfortunately, for politicians to try use reclaimers and people who are working in the zero waste system space for their own means with anything also that's already being organized and proceeding without their buy-in or their input as it stands right now. So we are running now towards the end of the session, but just to close things off, I just want to give our speakers just a final closing input from each of them. We'll start with Joe and Patrick, and then move on to Asiphile before just closing remarks to end off this afternoon's webinar. So Joe and Patrick.
I think just thanks for inviting us to participate. Certainly climate justice is starting to be a more and more important kind of strategy in our work with informal workers generally. So really nice to be part of a forum such as this. And yeah, I mean, we really are working at the sort of community grassroots level. And it would be, you know, the more these ideas get mainstreamed, hopefully the more support there will be for practices that already happen and are unrecognized, unappreciated. And there are benefits to be had for everyone, including the workers themselves, but for everyone. Want to add anything?
Just to say thank you for inviting us, and thank you very much. We're so grateful.
Asiphile?
Yeah, I say thank you for inviting us and for having this nice, interesting session. I would say my take home is that I've realized that that I've been alluding that zero waste is a journey. And it's up to us now, not just as activists, but as people that are on the ground and community level, on how to make it work, how to make it practical, how to basically achieve this vision that we want. It has to start with us. And also it means that we need to collaborate with our municipalities. We need to collaborate with our industries, whether we like it or not, because that's the only way the system is going to change. So that's my take home. Thank you.
And with that, I would like to thank our speakers this afternoon, Joanne Lees, Patrick Ndlovu, Asiphile Khanyile, for being here today, for sharing their insights, the presentation and thoughts on this very interesting topic of zero waste systems. Not even just interesting, but really integral in terms of the system and the change that we need to see in achieving these goals and these much needed objectives for climate, environmental and ecological justice, and also for the kind of social justice in terms of what people deserve to, the space that they deserve to live in, but also the people who are already facilitating and providing these services and the ways in which we can think about how they're already helping to create the next system in the now and what we need to do to see that being scaled up. So I want to thank all of you for being here today. And just to remind you that we are continuing with our zero waste focus. This month we'll have a couple of more sessions like this and other webinars touching on other topics within the concept of zero waste and zero waste systems from the end of this month into the start of next month. Look out for our next webinar, which should be in the week of the 26th. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone. Please, for any more information, just keep following and looking on our social media pages. Our Twitter page is CJ Charter SA, at CJ Charter SA, and that's where any other information will be posted online. So please make sure to follow. We'll stay in touch. And thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you and goodbye.